Thanks a lot for being here. It's lovely seeing people coming in to the Zoom room and seeing some familiar names. So thank you for your loyalty to these webinars. And if you're here for the first time, welcome. Let me just explain for those of you who might be here for the first time how this works. So my name's Emma Smith. I'm the general editor of the Oxford World's Classics Shakespeare. And each month we are in conversation with one of the scholars produced our new editions. And today I'm going to be talking with Brandi Adams from Arizona State University about Julius Caesar, which I'm really, really looking forward to. It's been an absolute privilege, as I've said before, of this job to pick wonderful people to write really interesting, lively things about plays that they think deeply about, and the results have been fabulous. So we'll get to Brandi in a minute, but just a couple of housekeeping things. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A in Zoom. And if you have a question as we go through, it would be great if you just put it as soon as you think of it, because it's been a bit difficult for us to get to all the questions sometimes, but we will try. So do ask a question if there's something that you would like us to work with. And also, if you've been before, you'll know that the thing that I think we all really enjoy about these webinars is that people come with all kinds of expertise, levels of expertise or levels of prior knowledge. So we're going to start with some quite general and introductory things about Julius Caesar, and then move on to some other kinds of questions and areas. So I hope wherever you would put yourself in terms of Julius Caesar, no oldness, you'll find something that's interesting to you today. And one last thing is to talk about the editions that we are working with. So the new Oxford Shakespeare, which was a big editorial project, and to present Shakespeare in new and exciting ways, edited by Gary Taylor, John Jowett, Terry Boras and Gabriel Egan, and published by Oxford University Press in 2016. That's the underlying text that we are using. So we're absolutely dependent on the new Oxford Shakespeare editor's work, and particularly for Julius Caesar on Sarah Neville, Sarah Neville's work. And if you stick with this webinar, you'll meet Sarah at some later point, because she is introducing one of the plays later in the series. Brandi, sorry about all that introduction. Where are you talking to us from?
Right now, I'm in Baltimore, Maryland, because I am here for this summer. I'm going to be doing a fellowship at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. It's a short train ride away. So I'm very fortunate to be able to be here out of the Arizona heat for the next couple of months.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us. Okay, so when I asked you to do the introduction to Julius Caesar, I think it didn't work like that, did it? I think I
No.
said, Brandi, I would love you to write an introduction to something. You're one of the first people on my wish list. And I think you picked Julius Caesar. So why did you pick Julius Caesar?
So, Julius Caesar, I was a classics major in undergrad along with English. And I read quite a bit about Julius Caesar in Roman history class and in Latin class. And so I kind of had this affinity to sort of learning more about him. And then when I finally read Julius Caesar, and I think I read it kind of late because a lot of people read it in high school. I didn't read it until I think it was maybe my second or third year of university. I was utterly fascinated by the play because it diverges so much from what I was expecting. And I've kind of been thinking about that play ever since. And I finally got to teach it for the first time 2 years ago at Arizona State University. And I was really excited about the play, but my students in the class, the students of the class were like, oh, we read this in high school. What are you going to do that's any different? And by the end, after we had all worked together for 2 weeks on it, they're like, okay, maybe this play is a lot better than what I thought it was. And so after thinking about all of the plays that I could have chosen from, I immediately thought of Julius Caesar, and I was hoping that it wasn't taken. And so when I asked you, you were a little surprised, I think, and said you want to do that, and I was absolutely. And that's sort of how I got started.
That's so great because in some ways I think Julius Caesar has a slightly different place in the American educational and sort of Shakespearean mind. I don't think probably somebody will say in the chat that this is untrue. I don't think anybody in the UK studies Julius Caesar at school. It's not part of our and we're not perhaps so into the sort of rhetorical republic sort of model that maybe is that part of its place in the American high school? Is it rhetoric or what is
I
it that
think I think part of it's rhetoric, part of it that, well, I think people think that there's not a lot of controversial stuff in the play,
oh
which
there's no
actually,
sex.
yes, there's no sex. There's I also think they think of it as sort of a non-controversial play, which I would completely disagree with. Um, but and I also think it might be where you live in the United States and where you go to school. I went to an all-girls school in Baltimore, and we read sort of like Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, and I think we read The Tempest, which I thought was, in retrospect, like, oh, that was neat.
Mm,
Um, and so we didn't, like, Julius Caesar wasn't even on
mm,
my teachers. I think they were like, yeah, you'll get to that at some point, but they were sort of more interested in the other plays. And then my friends who lived out west said, oh, no, no, Julius Caesar was one that we absolutely had to read. So I'm also wondering if it has to do with like where you live in the US, and what school you go to, or what school boards get to make
mm,
decisions. And since my school didn't have a national board or a state board,
mm,
the teachers just kind of taught what they
mm.
wanted to.
Yeah, Raphael's pointed out that he did study Julius Caesar in GCSE last year. Great,
Mhm.
Raphael. Yeah, okay, so that's my first uh, first wrong thing of the webinar. There will be many more. So we think we put Julius Caesar sort of right in the middle-ish, or that it's the 1599, that great year of Shakespeare's writing, isn't it? So where would you put it? How would you locate it in Shakespeare's writing career? What's the sort of in? It's after he's talked about English history, isn't it? And before
Yes.
he moves
Yeah.
into yeah.
Yeah. It's after the big English plays. And depending on who you talk to, it's near Hamlet, which is why I
Mm,
think sometimes people like to compare the two, because there are some moments, particularly the last time that I read it, because before I'd be like, I don't see any
mm,
similarities, and now I'm like, okay, maybe these folks had a point. There are some moments where it seems like um, uh, Julius Caesar and Hamlet could be in conversation with one
mm,
another, along with a lot of other plays that were being produced at the time as well. But in terms of Shakespeare's career, um, it does seem like there's this sort of um, holdover about like sort of political intrigue and interpersonal politics. And instead of having families that we sort of know because of English history, like that they're directly connected, I think that the really interesting thing about Julius Caesar is that you can read it and maybe not know all of the interconnections between the folks who are the main players, if you haven't spent time reading the sources.
mm,
And you might just say, wow, there's just a lot of intrigue between and among these folks.
mm,
But then if you end up reading Plutarch, you learn there's a lot of intermarriage that's happened. There's these people sort of have the same familial structures that you see, and like the Henry Anne plays, you can see them in when you sort of sit down and realize that, like, in Richard II, everyone's related and they're all fighting for this crown.
mm,
The discussions that are happening over what's going to happen to Rome are essentially happening among a very particular class of people, who are all intermarried, but that
mm.
doesn't really get explained during the course of the play.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Let's I want to come back to that, but should we just have a go at the plot of the play? Do you
Yeah.
just want to describe it? Maybe not too detailed. What's the overall shape
Okay, so
is yeah, go on.
The way that I might describe it is that the whole point of the play, at least in my mind, and other people could completely disagree with me,
They're not
is
here. They're not being, and
is
also they were never asked to do it. So I
is to
care not
try
for them.
to is to try to understand why in the third act Julius Caesar is murdered on the steps of the Capitol by all of these people who were supposedly his sort of he thought his political friends, but ended up being sort of these sort of rivals. And as you sort of try to unpack all of the reasonings, you learn that there's this fear that's that sort of has taken over all of the patricians or sort of the upper echelons of Roman society, those who could stand for office and have a political role are desperately afraid that they're going to lose their status because Julius Caesar keeps gaining power. Um, and there's all these secret meetings, and people are talking to one another and trying to figure out what his motives are that they think for the Roman Republic. And you have sort of his both very close friend and terrible rival, Marcus Brutus, who at the beginning is kind of waffling about what he should or shouldn't do about Julius Caesar because he believes in his heart of hearts that Julius Caesar is going to ruin Rome. There are a bunch of people called conspirators who include Cassius and Casca, and there's a whole list of people who have already sort of decided that Julius Caesar is the problem in Rome. And the only thing that they can do in order to save Rome is to kill Julius Caesar. And they approached Marcus Brutus about this. And after sort of having this big speech about what he should do, which is actually one of my favorite speeches in the play, decides that that is the answer. And the way that they sort of rationalize this to themselves is to call him a tyrant and to decide that everything that he's done or wants to do or could potentially do would just wreak havoc on Rome. Meanwhile, Julius Caesar himself is this kind of complicated character because he's portrayed both as someone who is super strong, super capable, but also disabled. He has an epileptic event while sort of working with or seeing the people. Um, and he's just this really great figure because you can't quite tell what's going on because he's this really beautiful, at least I think, speeches that kind of make him seem like he himself is larger than life. But then at the same time, he has these sort of intimate moments with Calpurnia, his wife, and then and conversations with Mark Antony, who ends up becoming really important after Caesar dies. Caesar dies early in the play, and so a lot of people are like, should this play even be called The Tragedy of Julius Caesar? Because he exits quite early. But I would say it still deserves to be called Caesar because Caesar haunts us throughout the rest of the play. And once Caesar is murdered at on the steps of the Capitol, Mark Antony is the one who kind of takes charge of what could be considered revenge to sort of make up for the crime that he perceives has happened. He also calls in Octavius Caesar, who actually becomes the first emperor of Rome later. Um, and for this very short moment of time, Mark Antony, Octavius Caesar, and Lepidus form this second triumvirate of leaders in Rome. This is a very loose political alignment because I don't want to spoiler alert, but there's another play that follows this one, Antony and Cleopatra, in which we see what happens to Mark Antony and his sort of connection with Octavius Caesar disappears. Anyway, back to Julius Caesar. Um, After Julius Caesar dies, both Mark Antony and Brutus give speeches. And for those of you who have studied the play before, these are sort of the really big famous speeches. Brutus goes first, and he allows Mark Antony to speak. Um, the other conspirators, particularly Casca, or sorry, Cassius, are not really sure that that's the best way to go. Mark Antony is a very gifted speaker, and by the time the speeches are finished, the people of Rome turn against the conspirators who they were in support of. They were like, oh, it sounds like Julius Caesar was probably a bad guy. Let's go ahead and allow this sort of murder to be sort of accepted. By the time Mark Antony finishes his speech, everything has been turned upside down. The conspirators are now the people who are being attacked by the people of Rome, and this sort of turns into an all-out civil war. Cassius and Brutus, who at one point were friends, have a really rough moment in the sort of latter part of the play, and Brutus begins questioning Cassius and his motives. There's a lot of evil words that happen between them. And then eventually, Julius Caesar's ghost appears for a moment, which is always really exciting. Sometimes people don't like that part of the play. I think it's really, really fun. And that sort of signals that things are sort of coming to a close. Um, Mark Antony and Octavius Caesar battle with Brutus and Cassius. There's a like quite a few battles. There's a miscommunication about sort of how things are going. Cassius commits suicide because he thinks that the battle, has gone completely haywire. And then unfortunately, Brutus does something similar after another battle because he doesn't want to be killed by Mark Antony, and he doesn't want to be killed by the Rome that he was trying to fight, or sort of the coming of Rome that he was trying to fight. Um, and in the end, Mark Antony is just like, we must celebrate Brutus because he really did put Rome above everything else. Um, and there's all other kinds of things that happen. I am not mentioning all of it. This is kind of like a very quick overview. There's also interventions from Brutus's wife, Portia, who's, I think, an extremely important marginalized character, as well as Julius Caesar's wife, Calpurnia. There are lots of conversations, snippets of conversations that we get from the plebeians or the people who are sort of observing all of this with maybe a bit of wonder, maybe a bit of confusion, maybe a bit of cynicism, because they're just like the start of the play. I should mention, begins with a death of another political figure, Gaius Pompey, and Caesar and Pompey kind of had this complicated relationship that sits outside the play. And so there's just political machinations and death and destruction that sort of sit on this play completely. And I think that's probably what makes it kind of an enjoyable read. And to see it performed is wonderful when you have actors who have the right chemistry to sort of show the complete tension that's both personal and political that comes into play. Does that work?
That's a brilliant, brilliant overview of it, Brandy. That's completely fabulous. And I was thinking as you were describing it, you were very, very careful to describe it in sort of non-judgmental terms. So you say, they think that Caesar is trying to get more power. On the one hand, Caesar is strong, on the other hand, he's sort of human and weak and so on. Do you think, I mean, it is the really famous thing about the play, isn't it? The sort of the apparent balance.
Mhm.
Um, I think the early modern period inherited a view of Brutus as the assassin as just one of the worst,
Mhm.
didn't they? I mean, there was quite a clear sense already that Shakespeare moves his play into where we might have expected Brutus to be just the wicked, evil guy, and he isn't really that, or he isn't quite that. What do you think about do you think is it the case that the play is politically balanced? Is it able to see both Caesar and the conspirators, and I suppose the regular people as well?
I struggle with that because I think I try very hard when reading this play not to think about all of the sources that also have a lot of judgment that's built into them. And to me, it does seem that um, this play makes Brutus judges him a little bit, at least, to
Mm.
say, here are his actions and his equivocations that then turn into this decision that has these huge consequences. And he gets to lean on this rhetoric of, I'm just doing this for Rome. I'm just doing this for Rome. And there are obviously moments in the play where, like, you, as a reader, at least I am the first time I was like, is he really doing this for Rome? Or does this have something to do with his own sort of sense of how things should be despite how they are? Um,
Mm.
and so I think that that's something, at least as a reader. And then when I started thinking about what Shakespeare was doing was, particularly if I think about other Caesar plays that existed at the time, and there were several, he seems more judgmental about Brutus.
Oh, okay, interesting.
And at least I think so.
That's really
But
interesting.
I also think that there's a way, because I tend to hedge when I read, because I don't like to make judgments on the characters, because I think that there's these very interesting ways that you can read everything in terms of like what Caesar is doing. Um and I think that Brutus is complex, um, and I definitely don't see him as, I think like sometimes in like in a lot of American contexts, he's sort of produced or sort of promoted as this hero, and I sit in the audience questioning that, but then I
Uh-huh.
question everyone in Julius Caesar. Um, it's a play full of people that I are full of characters that I really enjoy reading, but probably wouldn't want to be friends
Mm.
with.
Mm.
So yeah, and
It's
I
a
think
good Shakespeare model, isn't it? I think
yeah,
we had
there
this.
is
We had something a bit similar to this in webinars before. Who would you want to be? Who would you want to be friends with? I'm just thinking though. Um, I'm thinking about the way the play opens, and there's that in Act 1, Scene 2. There's cheering off stage, isn't there? Brutus and Cassius are talking, what's happening, and they say, "Oh, Caesar has been offered the crown. He's been offered to be made king." And the crowd want him to take it, and Caesar's refusing the crown.
Mhm.
I just think that's such a fascinating start. I mean, A, it's fascinating that to want to be a king or for a political system to have a king as being a bad thing is such
Mhm.
an extraordinary thing to imagine in the Elizabethan, in the
Yes,
last years of Elizabeth's reign, isn't it? Where there's no, you're in an English context which has no political system without a king. So
right,
it's
right.
already a real sort of head turn to think, okay, he wants to be king, and oh, okay, that's a bad thing. But and also it's so Shakespearean to have it off stage. So we
Yes.
don't know. We don't know whether Julius Caesar is sort of if only, but no, I mustn't, or
Mhm.
or if he's just saying, no, no, I really don't want to. So
Yeah.
it, it's completely not that it would necessarily be knowable if we saw it, but we would have a different access to that moment than Shakespeare decides to give us.
Mhm.
Um, so it sets us off, doesn't it, on a way of sort of just not knowing who to trust actually in their political
Absolutely.
commentary. Yeah.
And there's also sort of that line that Cassius, I think it's Cassius who says something like, well, it's not really a crown, it's more like a laurel. So there's this kind of
Mm.
petty ness that sort of undercuts that whole scene anyway, because he's like, well, they're offering him a crown. He shouldn't really have it. He's probably feigning that he doesn't want it. And there's this entire sort of interpretive act that's going on. And the audience and readers, you're like you said, can't know. So we're always kind of looking, um, particularly after Julius Caesar's death, we're always looking at Julius Caesar and Julius Caesar's legacy through
Mm.
these other characters and their discussions
Mm.
about him and what he's supposed to do and what he's not supposed to do.
Mm.
And that just seems to be part and parcel of most political systems where we don't really ever know what a politician truly thinks.
Yeah.
We only get people surmising, like on the news, saying, like, well, I think
Yeah.
that this
Or a
person
kind of spin,
did.
don't we? Yeah.
Right.
I feel
And
that too about Caesar's will. That's one of
mhm,
Mark Antony's great. sort of
Yes.
rhetorical tricks, isn't it, to say, well, Caesar's dead, and he loved you all so much, and he's left his gardens for you to walk in, and he's left you this little bit of money for you to spend on yourselves. And
Exactly.
I mean, that we never know if he has or hasn't really. I mean, Mark Antony could just be saying it, and we
Mhm.
all think, "Oh,
Yeah,
Caesar, what a
of course,
nice
yes.
man."
Caesar really meant well, but
Yeah,
we don't know.
but
And
did he?
and the truth of the matter is that even if you get, Brutus's speech about how important Rome is, that again, we don't know. Because people say all sorts of things.
Mm,
And it is really interesting, like you said, to sort of have this whole discussion about the whether or not it's good for a Republican state to have a monarch
mm,
when you have an aging monarch yourself,
mm,
in early modern England, because at this time, um, Elizabeth was quite elderly-ish,
mm,
and succession is something that the English must have been thinking about, particularly as she's getting older. They're like, well, what's
mm,
going to happen next to us? And this whole play has to do with who has the right to be in charge of a country.
mm,
And this is a nice way to sort of sublimate it if you're watching a play that doesn't technically have to have a monarch, but they're
mm,
talking about the sort of futurity of Rome.
mm,
You can think about the futurity of England without actually having to articulate. I'm actually very worried about what's going to happen if and when our queen, goes to heaven. What's going to happen to
mm,
the country itself if we don't have a direct line of succession?
mm.
And I
And it's
think,
that year, isn't it? Is it that year that the
yes,
Privy Council say no English history anymore? It's
yes,
all too dangerous and too
yes,
close. So
exactly.
Shakespeare, one reading, I suppose, of the play, Shakespeare just turns his attentions on exactly the same questions.
It's somewhere
How does
else.
politics work? What makes a good ruler? How does the ruler cope with challenges to his authority, but just does it in the Roman context instead of in the English medieval one?
Yeah, and traces of Rome are everywhere in England, from the aqueducts to, at the time, remember reading a little bit about how there's, a tower that Julius Caesar supposedly ate at.
Mm.
There's tapestries in different parts of, palaces like Hampton Court.
Yeah.
There's busts. So it's like it's not difficult to kind of do a reading of Rome at that sort of, it makes it equal to England. And that is something that if you're an audience member, you can choose to take in, or you can say, nope, I'm just very concerned about what's going on in the state of Rome in this sort of more general,
Mm.
way.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I've always felt as well that there's a bit of Macbeth in
Hmm.
Brutus, or there's a bit of the interest in Macbeth that's going to be developed at more length. To be in the uh, what's it like to be the sort of conspirator or the assassin? What's
Right.
it like to have done that? And there's the sort of sense that Brutus is a little bit of a sort of early sketch in a way for the character who's gonna become Macbeth. Hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting pairing. I think you get sort of two sides of you get sort of the beginning sort of waffling about what to do, whereas Macbeth kind of knows the answer and knows that there are steps that one needs to take in order to sort of have this happen, and you can deny it, but you can keep going. And
Mm,
I think that Brutus's path to tyrannicide, or to, I mean, it's not murder. It is murder. It's not really regicide because Julius Caesar is not a king.
mm,
It's like murdering someone who is like a king and then actually murdering a king.
mm,
Uh, and I also think that there's like a bit of Hamlet thrown in there as well, where it's like, do I do this? Do I not do this?
mhm,
But Brutus has the sort of the emotional and psychological support of his idea of Rome.
mm,
that he's sort of acting as a protector. And I don't, I didn't really get that from Macbeth, that he's not like
No, you're absolutely right. So how Scotland is
Ireland,
deployed in
right?
Macbeth
He's not, yeah,
is
it's
against
like,
Macbeth, isn't it? It's
yeah.
really, really interesting.
And
Even at the end, they're saying about Brutus, you know, he was the noblest Roman of them all. The others did what they did for jealousy or whatever, and so so the sort of eulogy for him at the end, I guess once you've defeated your enemies, you can afford to be nice about them, which is kind of
right. You
what's
can, yeah,
happening.
you can always sort of ensure their legacy. And
Yeah.
again, I think this all has to do with sort of protecting the interests of the political elite. And you can write off some of the other people. You can say, oh, we really blame um, Cassius, and gets a super bad rap sort of at the end. It's like, oh, he was the worst. He was actually the instigator. Brutus really, really cared about Rome. And I feel like when you have political funerals, particularly in the US, people are surprised that all these political elites show up for these funerals. People who were on separate parties, who disagreed all the time, who are sitting and shaking hands and
Mm,
being sad together at a funeral. And and I think for sometimes for those of us on the outside of these structures are like, wait, were they all really friends all along?
mm,
Or did they have these like connections that are beyond the connections that we see? And particularly when Brutus is like, Julius Caesar was my greatest lover, and yet I had to make sure that he dies.
mm,
Um, there's this tension that's quite confusing.
mm,
And I think that that's something that really um, that's a part of the play as well. That you've got this elite group of people who, no matter what, they'll be fine.
mm.
Um,
Yep.
and then they're fighting for honor, fighting for Rome, while the rest of the people who are shoemakers um, and who have other crafts and other jobs that they have to do are just kind of watching this like a panorama and sort of expecting, well, there's going to be some new patrician rulers, but they're all still going to be patrician, and there's all, it's all
Yeah.
essentially going to be the same.
What do you think Shakespeare feels about, how do you think he depicts those ordinary people working? I mean, we're taught, aren't we? You're not allowed to say class about the Elizabethan period. You've got to say social status, or you've got to say rank or something. But these are sort of lower status working people, aren't they? And they seem they're a part of the political process. That's how the Roman Republic sort of works
Yeah.
in a way that they're not really part of the English
Mhm.
political process. And I suppose there's been quite a lot of discussion, hasn't there, about whether Shakespeare is a sort of democrat, I mean, in a small d sense,
Right.
um, or does he think that it's right for these people to have a stake in the political system, or does he show them to be sort of unworthy of it and incapable um of holding a proper opinion?
I think we get a little bit of both, because I really like the opening of the play where we have folks who are taking a holiday and they're not wearing the clothing of their trade that they're supposed to be wearing, and they're just like, we're just here to celebrate Julius Caesar. It's a holiday. And I think of the people and the the sort of non-patrician, the plebeian, the regular people, as really savvy and sharp. And I think they understand that they have a role in what's going on, but it's an extremely limited one um, at the beginning of the play. Once Mark Antony kind of gives them the the ability to riot and to kind of um, have an effect on what's going on, I think it does show the danger that people can have, as in like large groups, to
Mm,
any kind of political structure. But it also shows like how that balance can be overturned. Um, but at the same time, I think that Shakespeare's like these things can kind of bubble up, but they get
Mm,
suppressed really
mm,
quickly. Because at the end, you've got Mark Antony who's taken, even though he sort of opened Pandora's box, somehow he's able to clamp it back down using military forces. So it's the people are used sort of in these very
mm,
effective ways. But I think Shakespeare makes them so clever that I tend to think that, oh, they know what they're able to do.
mm,
Particularly when they murder the poet Cinna. They're
mm,
just like, he's like, no, I'm not Cinna the conspirator, I'm Cinna the poet. They're like, oh, just murder him for his bad verses.
mm,
There's this, I think there's this moment where the people realize that they do have this kind
mm,
of life or death power when it's sort of that opportunity comes up.
mm, mm. I suppose if we were at the theatre, we would have been those people,
Hmm.
wouldn't we? Rather than the, I wonder how people who went to the Globe, um, I always think that, we've got all these Shakespeare plays about these upper class figures, whatever the class situation is, whatever the social situation is, the plays tend to be focused on them. There's often some lower status people, and it's one reading of all those plays, whether it's Much Ado About Nothing or Henry V or Julius Caesar, whatever, is that the players looks down on them. But I wonder if in performance, if you've got a big crowd of people who identify with them, somehow they become more heroic in the space of the theatre.
I think so too, that there's this moment where it's like you as a like the people who spent a day's wages or whatever it was to go and see this play have you get to see what kind of power you have over like how you what kind of power you have as an audience, especially during the funeral speeches. You can be like, yes, I really liked Brutus' speech, that was amazing, but then I had Mark Antony give this sort of barn burner of a speech, and the crowd that's performing as a crowd goes wild, and then maybe that tells the audience that they too get to choose about which speech was better, or which one was more persuasive, and to sort of understand how crowds can have an effect on performance. And I
Mm,
think that that gets mentioned a lot in the play too. It's like, oh, if we did this like our Roman actors, oh, if we did this like
mm,
this. And as an audience member, I'd be like, oh, I have a decision in whether or not this
mm,
play, gets revived, and like this was good, or oh, I got bored in the middle of it, or
mm,
there plays are this play in particular, I think, is very quick to acknowledge its audience,
mm,
to acknowledge that they are in this sort of theatrical production, particularly when after Julius Caesar is murdered. And I can't remember who has the line, but they talk about how this thing that they've done will be performed in many languages, many of which are unknown, which is true, that happens down the line. But like if you're standing in the audience in like the late 1590s, early 1600s watching this, and you're like, wait, I'm in the audience in which this is being performed in this one language. What
mm,
other languages might this be performed in?
mm,
And am I a part of this sort of ongoing legacy of this play, which is a performance of this historical moment that we're all supposed to know about, or maybe we've studied in school, or maybe we've randomly heard about. And I think that there's this really wonderful moment where the audience does get called into the play itself in a lot of really fun ways.
mm, mm. Let's have a look, Brandy, at your slides. So you'll remember that we shall I get it?
Oh,
Everybody every time we try and have something in a little bit more detail, and I asked Brandy to pick um, what she wanted us to talk about, and it's this speech that you already mentioned, I think. And let's just spend a few minutes on this speech of Brutus's in Act Two. Tell us why you what you wanted us to sort of notice or think about.
Okay. The first time, or maybe that's not true, maybe the second or the third time I read this play, I stopped fully at this speech because this, I think, is the moment, or I could argue this is the exact moment where Brutus, after all kinds of thoughts and cogitations and inability to make a decision about what to do, this is the moment where he begins to rationalize um, the murder of Julius Caesar. And he does it in this way that is quite rhetorically brilliant by likening him um, to this thing that could do something as opposed to somebody who has done something. And when I teach this play, I like to have students read, and it takes us a little bit of time, but to read the entire speech and to think about what happens as Brutus is kind of rationalizing this decision. And I like to sort of spend quite a bit of time on the first four-ish lines because he starts by sort of arguing it has to be by his death, so it must be by his death. And then he immediately says, I know no personal cause to spurn at him, but for the general. So he doesn't have like a very specific reason. He only has these sort of general reasons that everybody else has decided that Julius Caesar should not remain um, in some kind of political power. And it's all the would be's, could be's, should be's. So it's like he would be crowned. And then he admits how that might change his nature. There's the question. The question then becomes like, is he necessarily going to be the Julius Caesar that they all think he's going to be? Nobody knows. And so that it must be by his death, which you sort of understand as like this complete decision that happens, then gets undermined immediately. And then we start sort of talking about all of the things that Julius Caesar could do. And then Brutus undercuts it and says something like, and to speak truth of Caesar, I have not known when his affection swayed more than his reason. He's like, you know what? Julius Caesar's actually really reasonable and really smart, but never mind, we still need to kill him. And then he's like, okay, wait a minute, wait a minute. What if I compare him to an unborn snake? Snakes are bad. We should probably kill snakes. So that's how we're going to sort of rationalize
Mm,
um, getting rid of Julius Caesar because Julius Caesar may do these things. Not that he will or that he has. And so I just love this speech because as I'm reading it and as I've seen it performed, I'm sitting there going like, but you keep undercutting yourself for this action that's about to come. And the other thing is there's not a real mention of Rome.
mm,
This is all I'm my personal relationship with him, not here are all the things that he's going to do to the larger Roman Republic. And we get this like very wonderfully complex metaphor about what he could do. And the thing that seems to be the most problematic with everybody, or everybody has with Julius Caesar, is ambition.
mm,
And that's the thing that this speech is really um, condemning. It's ambition.
mm,
People don't like, and Brutus particularly doesn't like that he's going to do something that will sort of put him above everyone else.
mm,
There's some lines a little bit further down where there's he's worried about Julius Caesar climbing up this ladder and
mm,
pulling the ladder up from from Brutus. And so that's when I start to say, how much is this about Brutus and how much of this is about Rome?
Yeah.
This speech is where I start to not believe Brutus in terms of his complete. I'm not saying he doesn't love Rome because he really loves Rome a lot. But here is the moment where I want students and I myself begin to question exactly what is going on here
Oh,
and
that's
really,
I'm so pleased you showed us that. So it must be by his death. It's not really clear what the it is it? I mean,
yes.
what is going to be achieved by this? And then that ladder is so good just to sit with it and to see we've got one, two, three, four, five, six and a half, six lines.
Mhm.
It's as if he keeps getting snarled up with the fact that Caesar isn't really like this. And so then he has another run at a sort of generalization about people who are ambitious, and that gets a bit of momentum going. And then as soon as he brings it back to Caesar, so Caesar may,
Hey,
then
right?
lest he may prevent. It's so interesting. It is a really good example of that sort of Montaigne moment that lots of critics have suggested Shakespeare gets sort of around this time, don't they? Around Hamlet, and that he gets from Montaigne, who he probably reads in Florio's translation, still in manuscript, a sense of how the mind sort of works moment to moment and trying to capture that in these speeches. Um, uh, yeah, it's so brilliant. It's so brilliant.
Yeah. And I
Brilliant.
think that
Let's
makes him, yeah, a
you sorry,
fantastic.
I'm into you keep going. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to start to look at the questions.
Oh, of course, of course.
But you keep going.
No, I was just saying that that's what I think makes him a really terrific character. And I don't know if he's I mean, I think there are definitely people who read the play where Brutus is some kind of a hero. I don't read him that way, but I think of him he has the same kinds of complexities for me that somebody like Aaron does in Titus Andronicus, where there are these moments where you're like, no, there's a lot going on as the character is trying to
Mm,
rationalize and think and understand and articulate what they're trying to do. And
mm,
I think of them a lot together too.
mm. Just before we finish on that, it's a great point by Stephen Watkins. Hi, Stephen. It's great to have you. Um, about responsibility and causality, and he just picks out Caesar would be crowned. Is that a conditional or a synonym for wants to be? So
Mm,
is it sort of grammatically about the future, or is it about what he wants, and how does that play on this ambition? That's a really great point.
that is.
Thank you, Stephen. Okay, let's look and Hamim, that's a nice point about ladder and adder, two images of potential perils intertwined by the rhyme. Really beautifully noticed. And let's think about some of the other questions. So we've got a couple of questions about the women.
Mm,
Kitty has asked particularly about Portia. Why does she take such severe action and wound herself? And we had another question quite early on from let me just see. S. Coleman, what is your take on Shakespeare's portrayal of the female characters? So, can you say a bit more about that? You said how interesting Portia is as a sort of marginalized but rather still quite powerful figure. So,
yeah. I I think about Portia and Calpurnia as members. So like in classical Rome, most women were limited to the domus or the home, and but they could have sort of very powerful. And this is like upper class women. I'm not. I'm really limiting myself to that. And Portia in particular is really. She talks a lot about who her father is, like what kind of familial line that she comes from, which is really important in Rome. Blood and station were extremely important. And I think that Portia, particularly with the self-harm that happens, is a way to show both her physical and emotional toughness because she wants to be a part of these larger conversations that are happening. When the conspirators come, she tries to get this information out of Brutus. And he's like, and then she's like, what? Am I just simply here for your needs, sexual and otherwise? And he's like, no, that's not it. But Portia um, is someone who actually kind of reminds me a little bit, now that you've mentioned the Macbeth connection, a little bit of Lady Macbeth, where there's this desire to be a part of um, the group of men who are trying to take over Rome, but because she is married to Brutus and is not Brutus's brother, she has no recourse to be a part of that action. And I think she constantly leans back or leans on her familial connections and sort of the fact that, she comes from this very important family. And yet, while everything is happening at the Capitol, she has to send a servant out to find out what's going on and to report back and to get information because she's just limited um, by Rome and also by the Domus. And I think that the same thing happens with Calpurnia when she convinces Caesar for about 35 seconds not to go to the Capitol during the Ides or the 15th of March, the day that he gets murdered. And she's like, look, I've had dreams. We heard from the soothsayer who said you need to be aware of this bad thing is going to happen to you. And Caesar is like, okay, actually, we're in this structure. She's persuading me in this really important way. And then Decius Brutus comes in and is like, that's just a woman's dream. Don't worry about it. So the power of sort of the structures of the patriarchy that are outside that rule Rome leak into the house, and then she loses the limited amount of political power that she has inside of the Domos. And so I think both of the women are try to do what they can with the structures that they have, but Rome is larger and more misogynist and sort of takes control of both spaces inside the Domus and outside of the Domus. And that's unfortunate because they're both really powerful and articulate characters who get dismissed. And then when Portia dies, and it's a pretty brutal uh, suicide. Um, the reaction to it, I think, depends on the actor. When I read it, I was a little bit like, that's it. But when I've seen it performed, I was like, okay, there's a way to sort of do this that Brutus is truly horrified by Portia's death, but like it all gets sort of mentioned as in conversation, and there's like kind of an announcement about it, but it sort of shows how these women are pushed to the margins of the play despite their trying to sort of push into the play itself.
Mm. That's so interesting that there's nothing about them. I was just looking at Debolina's question, which is, do you think it's wrong that after Caesar's death there isn't any mention of Calpurnia? How does she react? And we have completely moved away. I mean, part of the answer to that is we've moved away from the space where those women sort of have anything, kind of anything to say, really. I've got a cluster of questions that are sort of about classical antecedents, I think. Claire Wakeham, hi Claire, it's lovely to have you here. Claire says that the interiority thing that I just attributed to Montaigne is actually from Plutarch. That's via James Shapiro's book, 1599. We always do give out shout outs to things that you might want to read. And 1599, Jim Shapiro's brilliant book about a year in the life of Shakespeare, on this play and on As You Like It and on Henry V is really, really, really brilliant. So Claire says that is it Plutarch who the influence is not just subject matter, but made available to Shakespeare a model for conveying interiority, something as yet he failed to do in a sustained way in his plays. That's really, really interesting. Someone asked what you thought about Octavius Caesar compared to his sort of classical, his the real person. And somebody asked about let me just think about. Sorry, I felt there was another one that was sort of about Plutarch, but let's start with those. So Octavius Caesar and the question about, oh, why does Shakespeare exclude the fact that Brutus uh, might be Caesar's son, as touched on in Plutarch?
So I can start with the last question. Plutarch actually doesn't mention there's this, I think it's Suetonius. There's like this rumor that when Brutus kills, is the sort of stab to Caesar, Caesar says "Kaisu teknon," which is like "and you, my son," which could be interpreted as "Are you literally my son, or you like my my kind of
Mm,
kid-like,
yeah.
son-like person." Plutarch doesn't actually mention that. Um, in fact, Plutarch is much more, well, Plutarch sort of does this panorama of what happens in sort of the violent explosion that sort of ends up with Julius Caesar's murder. And in Plutarch, Julius Caesar actually fights back until he sees Brutus, and then he kind of gives up. And so that's a really interesting moment that we don't, get to see in the play. And then as for Plutarch showing the interiority, I mean, I think that it could be both. It could be both Plutarch and Montaigne. And I also think it depends. I also want to acknowledge that Thomas North translated Plutarch's Lives. So we get a layer of Thomas North, who is actually translating it from the French. So we actually have another layer. So I'm not sure if we say interiority, where is the interiority coming from? Is it from North? Is it from the French translation, or is it from Plutarch um, himself? And that's not to say that Shakespeare couldn't have read all of this in Latin, but even in the Latin, I'm not sure that I see more of Plutarch's commentary on what these folks were thinking, because Plutarch actually accuses Caesar of ambition in like there's like the middle of his story. He's like, Caesar was kind of, or Brutus was kind of ambitious too. I stopped in my tracks because I was like, aha,
Mm.
Brutus did sort of have this moment where yes, he's honorable, but there's this like small moment where he's considered to be ambitious as well. And then the other question.
The other question was about Octavius.
Oh, Octavius Caesar. So
Yeah.
I really like, so Octavius Caesar was super fun to study as a classics major. And um, I think we get a better view of Octavius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra. In this one, he just kind of, um, he seems like this kind of weirdly ancillary character who just needs to pop in order to make sure that the end of this play happens.
Mm.
And I think that the sort of imperious, annoying, problematic Octavius Caesar we get to see more of in Antony and Cleopatra, or at least that's how I read it.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions about Antony and Cleopatra, really. We don't want to go too far into those, but Mama, good to see you again, is asking about how Mark Antony comes from being a loyal subordinate to being a sort of tragic imperial figure. And then there was another question I noticed, which was really about whether this was a kind of prequel almost, or whether the two plays were in that kind of relationship. And I suppose that fits with a final question kind of in that group. What is there in common? Is there anything in common between the so-called Roman plays? Is it just that they're in Rome, or is it a particular kind of tragedy? So anything on any of those, Brandi?
I think that the question about what happens to Mark Antony is something that's such a wonderful question, and really fantastic one to ask students if you read those plays one following the other. Um, this year when I co-taught this course and students were appalled. They were angry with Mark Antony because by the time he got to Antony and Cleopatra, they were like, "What happened? This is the person who effectively incited revenge for Julius Caesar, and then he turns into this kind of um, man who can only focus on what's going on with Cleopatra and what's going on in Egypt. And I think that there's a lot of different answers to that. But I actually don't think Mark Antony changes all that much. Um, I think Rome changes. Um,
Hmm.
and and there's also sort of his, positionality, right? Like once you're in the middle of a city state and everything is going on and it becomes your entire life, and then sort of like the political system is upended, there's now this sort of loose triumvirate, and your reason for being, which at least in the play, he has this strong connection to Julius Caesar. It's gone. So he moves. And so for him, all of his perspective moves with him to the east, and not in sort of an orientalist way, like just directionally to the east, where he's not focused on Rome. And so
Mm.
your perspective changes, what matters changes, until he's drawn back in by Octavius Caesar, who's like, you need to pay attention what's happening here. And that's when sort of, I think all of that other stuff kind of happens. I think that the Roman plays, there's some really good books on why it's good for us to think about all of these plays that take place in Rome. Um, in tandem. Like it's like Antony and Cleopatra and Julius Caesar sort of make sense because they're in the same sort of time frame and universe historically. And then you have something like Titus Andronicus that takes place well um, into the empire, to the point where it's sort of a fictionalized empire, or kind of not. It depends. But I think it's good to sort of read them all together, because it kind of teaches us a little bit about an arc of Rome. Like what goes on in Coriolanus does have something to do with what's happening in Titus Andronicus. That does have something to do with what's happening in Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra. And some people might want you to think about the entire ancient world that gets portrayed in all of Shakespeare's plays. Um, that's probably for people who are much more brilliant than I am to sort of articulate what's going on in the classical world. But I think in terms of Rome, it tells me a lot about how city states change, and what kinds of things that you can learn at different points in time from different people. And what I do like about all the Roman plays is that we do get a lot of different folks. We get plebeians, we get enslaved people, we get patricians, we get emperors, and sort of that allows us to see. We get queens, Cleopatra, to sort of see what's going on in sort of this expansive Roman world.
Brilliant. So we've got a few people who have read. I want to shout out to them. So a couple of mentions of Shakespeare in India, very popular in schools in India, eighth standard in school from Shabanka, High Shabanka, and from Saved is teaching grade 9 and 10 and wants some teaching method. So if you can throw out any of those, that would be great. Um, Patricia, Stephen, and Jean all studied J Julius Caesar, so there's more of it than I thought. Um, and we've got two clusters of questions that I think we'll get to, and I don't think we're going to get to anything else. One is about Cassius and Brutus.
Mhm.
Is Cassius to blame? I mean, you did touch on this. How do we see Brutus's character? How do your students respond to Brutus, and has that changed over time? Um, so that's one. Should the play be called The Tragedy of Marcus Brutus? That kind of thing. So you did touch on that, Brandy, but could you say anything else about perhaps the relationship between Cassius and Brutus?
I think it's one where, if I can be a little bit not super serious, it is one of the most toxic friendships, I think, in all of Shakespeare, particularly because we've got the beginning where Cassius is trying to get Brutus to be a part of the conspirators, and then they are, you know, do this together. Cassius is much more firm in his belief that Julius Caesar be um, should be murdered, but he also is very open about how he compares himself to Julius Caesar, where he's like, how come this guy is like Colossus and we are not? I'm just as great as Julius Caesar. What about me? What about me? And it's less subtle than maybe Brutus when he has this beautiful adder ladder sort of moment in the play. Um, I think that I I don't want to give Brutus an out to allow to be able to say, oh, it's not, it's like he has no agency. He has complete agency. I think that Cassius is just a character who is quite persuasive, but Brutus really answers and decides to participate in this on his own. Um, but I do think that they have an extremely tense relationship. It's a very loving relationship, especially sort of in their big argument that happens on Cassius's birthday in I think it's Act Four. I think it's Act Four, where they sort of go back and forth, where Brutus is accusing Cassius of stealing money, and Cassius is saying, "I wrote to you for money to pay my soldiers, and you wouldn't do it." And there's this just whole like tense moment, and I think with the right actors, you can be like, well, I'm not quite sure what their relationship is. They seem extremely close, and toxically so. So I think together they are maybe the most toxic friends of Shakespeare.
Mm. Brilliant. There's some really interesting questions about free will and omens um and sort of the
Beautiful.
nature of tragedy, which I'm just going to leave hanging because I think the question that I want us to finish with, and I don't want to be sort of tendentiously topical, although John has suggested that maybe we'll have a version of this play with Caesar in a blue suit and red tie, which we did actually get, didn't we? Famously in Shakespeare in the Park in Trump's first presidency. But a couple of people are asking about tyranny, and tyranny is obviously that sort of Renaissance word that has. It's just a really bad thing to be, isn't it? A tyrant is just absolutely a bad thing. Um, how do you think tyranny is tyranny part of this mixture here? Is it the fear of tyranny that is sort of motivating things?
I think so. I think it's a double fear of tyranny and enslavement. There's this rhetoric about everyone in the it's Casca Cassius, where they're like, you know, bondsmen and enslaved people have the right to free themselves while there are enslaved people standing there. And the tyranny is this, it's more like a fictionalized or like a conception of tyranny that they believe that they're experiencing, that I think other characters in the play are actually experiencing, but they don't realize, they sort of don't recognize sort of irony of it. They don't recognize their own tyrannical behavior and the tyranny that they are participating in. But it's easy for them to point it out in Julius Caesar. And I think that for audience members, I don't know, that gets quite confusing to me because I'm like, what in the play has Julius Caesar done that's actually tyrannical? And Brutus sort of has that moment too, where he's like, well, he hasn't really done anything to me. And there isn't mentioning that he's like, you know, wreaked havoc on the state or taxed everyone or done something that's truly horrible. And like what the historical record says is completely different from what Shakespeare says. And I think you're right that their reaction to and sort of like we have to commit tyrannicide because tyranny is bad. Um, that is, I think, another thing that the play does is then that makes us question like what kind of tyranny is happening and for whom, and that's what's really interesting. And particularly in this political moment, particularly in the US, this discussion of like who's experiencing tyranny and how, and whether or not you actually recognize that um, you're under the aegis of tyranny. It's the play complicates that quite a bit.
Mm. Yeah, brilliantly done. I'm just gonna air some of the questions that we don't have time for, just so you can keep thinking about them. And in a minute, Brandy, to finish off, I'm going to ask you for your recommendation for anybody who wants to take this conversation further. So you can have a think about that. Um, Claire points out what a balancing act at a time of censorship and paranoia to portray an assassin. And yeah, I think that's such an interesting thought. The bishop's ban is a big sort of censorship moment all around this time. So yeah, that's a brilliant observation. John had made the point about the Trumpish. Um, Caesar, Brianna, could it have symbolic undertones about the Reformation and which institution is in the right for religious power? Really interesting idea. Um, Ume talking about repetition and omens and how that links into fate versus free will. Sam asking about the people and Rodri remembering Nick Heitner's 2018 production, which turned the audience into the plebeians. Yeah, Rodri, I think that was very much in my mind when I was thinking about where we are sort of in this, asking about future productions. Hamim, nice point about Hamlet and Julius Caesar connected. Doesn't Polonius remember that he played Caesar in the Capitol? He's obviously an actor who's very good at lying dead for quite a long time. That seems to be his special charism in the troupe. Um, and Sabine asks a really interesting question. What about the fact that it's a well-known event? How does that add to the nature of tragedy? And I think it's yeah interesting, fitting with what Brandy was saying about how the conspirators, the assassins already know it's a well-known event, even as they're doing it. It's kind of the weirdness is. Debelina points out that Octavius Caesar does become a dictator sort of by the end. So was it all even necessary? Um, and Chris, very nicely, thank you, Chris, has thanked us and said he first studied the play at school in South Africa. So he's talking about this mirror image, New Oxford Shakespeare that Brandy has written the introduction for. So before we finish, Brandy, what would you recommend to somebody who is inspired by this conversation to find out a bit more about Julius Caesar? Where would you go?
I would say if you would like to read more about sort of the Roman sources, to check out a translation of Plutarch. Um, I would also recommend seeing some of the productions that are online. One of my favorites of all times, I believe it's 2012, Greg Duran's Royal Shakespeare Company All African production of the African diaspora of Julius Caesar. That changed a lot of the ways I saw the play, to see as many different Julius Caesars as possible, because that seeing what actors do. I mostly work in book history, and I don't consider myself a theater historian or a performance scholar. And I tend to get overwhelmed in the theater. But if I really know a play well and I go see it, I'm continually impressed and astonished by what actors do with lines and the way that they challenge me to keep thinking about the play. Um, I would also say maybe take a look at the other Roman plays as well, if you're interested, just to see what connections you see. Jim Shapiro's 1599 is really wonderful, and I will absolutely do a plug for Emma Smith's essay in This Is Shakespeare, and all of her essays in This Is Shakespeare. I think are really helpful to try to consider so many different political contexts of this play. And there's lots of stuff we didn't get to mention, but there's so many things that you can read. But if any of you ever feel like asking me a question, you can find me by just typing in my name and Arizona State University and email. I may be a little slow this summer, but I promise I will get back to you. But just talk to people about this play and maybe do a reading group, because I think that talking with other people about what you read is how we learn a lot about the play itself and about sort of our own thoughts.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Brandy.
You.
Um, we are out of time. We always it always runs away with us a bit, but that's why these plays are so fascinating and kind of wonderful. There's always more to say. We've got 2 months off for the summer. We are 6 months in though, so if you were doing this to pass away a long 4 year period of in any way, we've reached a milestone. So well done. So we're not meeting in July or August. 2nd of September, we start back with Comedy of Errors. And in this autumn, we have also got, I just must look in my diary. I know we've got Merry Wives of Windsor, we've got Romeo and Juliet, and we've got Henry VIII. That's a corker autumn. So get ahead if you need to for our work for the autumn, or catch up with any of the ones that you've missed so far. And Brandy, thanks so much. It's been a really brilliant conversation, and thanks for your
You.
introduction, which is
Thanks so much for having
fabulous.
me. And thanks to everybody for taking the time
Yeah.
out to hang out with
Thanks,
us.
everyone. Thanks. Bye bye.